Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use this color layering Seahorse stamp set. Color layering stamp sets are some of my favorite, and I'll be sharing a bubble background tutorial on creating a really unique, different background to put your stamps on top of. These are perfect for any beachy, oceaning, whatever bubbles work well with. So I've got some mixed media heavy stock in white here. I would prefer to do this on the Distress White watercolor cardstock. However, I am out, my local store is out, as well as my local online store is back ordered. So I chose to use this white mixed media heavy stock instead, and it works. However, this white mixed media heavy stock doesn't necessarily love wet techniques. So I will let it dry at points in between this. And what I have here is a bowl that has some water with some dish soap in it. I put some Distress Re-Inker in there, and I'm just using a straw to blow in bubbles. For the first card, I used a knife to put the bubbles in the center of the card because I wanted to create a cluster in the center. And for the second one, I just used the cardstock to dig or to scoop up those bubbles, and then I let them pop on the cardstock, and I would recommend letting it dry in between different layers. I didn't do that on the one with the center, and I ended up having a little bit more opaqueness or a little bit more solidness to the image than I really wanted. But it's one of those things that's a learning process. Now, I really love how this just creates a unique and different background. However, you can see that I'm getting some of these bubbles and some of this ink on my surface here. So you do want to make sure that you're working on something that you can get wet. This is just my media surface mat here, so it's perfect for that. If you don't have something like that, you could even use just an inexpensive shower curtain just to cover your surface, just to make sure that you have something to contain that. Because I'm using the dye re-inker, you don't necessarily want, say, a tablecloth or something that could possibly be dyed or be stained from it. So something that's non-porous works perfectly. And what I'm basically doing is just kind of scooping these bubbles till I get the look that I'm going for. I do get to a point where enough is enough and I need to stop because I want to be able to see those bubbles still. But I do find that drying it in between time was the best way to create layers with this. Hardest part about this whole technique is finding utensils or finding something that isn't going to pop the bubbles when you're trying to transfer them over. And I did find I had the best luck with the second card where I just used the cardstock to scoop it up because I didn't have to try to carry something to the cards there. I also didn't really have a whole lot of control over how big my bubbles got. So I was just working with them how they were created, but it's just a fun and different way to create a unique background, and it's perfect for these Seahorse layering stamps. The bubbles are just perfect for this. I could see this being used on, say, a scrapbook background for like bath pictures or whatever with your baby or whatever. I think it would be fun for that as well. It's just something different, something that I saw somewhere in my scrolling at some point, and I don't even remember where I saw it. It just kind of stuck in my head. So once I have those backgrounds done, I'm letting them dry completely. So I did the backgrounds themselves at night, and this is the next day. I'm using my Misti stamping tool, and I have a waffle flower grip mat in there to hold my cardstock. However, as I mentioned before, this white mixed media heavy stock really doesn't like a whole lot of moisture, so it did warp a lot. So not only am I going to be using my grip mat, I'm also going to be using the magnets that come with the Misti in order to hold my cardstock down. I want to try to get as much of that warping out as possible, and by using both the grip mat and the magnets, it definitely helped. So I'm using 3 different colors of Distress ink here. I'm using shaded lilac, wilted violet, and Villainous potion. My mind just went completely blank there. So the first layer, I'm using the shaded lilac, and I am doing a couple different layers of that ink because I want to make sure to get a nice solid image, and I want to make sure that that ink is dark enough for my background. Now you'll notice that I left that solid stamp in there, and there's a reason for it, and it'll make sense in a minute. But I would suggest, and you'll see why in a little bit, putting a little piece of printer paper where that stamp touches that grip mat. So for the second color here, I'm using the Wilted Violet. And once again, I have my stamps lined up. With this Misti stamping tool, it's really easy to line them up, but what I would suggest, if you're not confident with it, what you can do is take a piece of acetate, put it on top of your cardstock, and then stamp with it just to make sure that you have everything lined up before you're doing your actual stamping. It's easy enough often if you're looking right over top to see the image and see exactly where it's stamping. But if you're not 100% sure and you want to make sure that stamps totally properly, the easiest way to get that done is to use a piece of acetate just to check to make sure that you're aligned properly. So I've got the second and third layer stamped here, and what I want to do now is I want to go back and I want to stamp that solid image with Versamark and then use some clear embossing powder. And this is why I left that stamp in there and didn't take it off. This way I know I have perfect placement. I don't have to place it a second time. And it's really easy. This Misti stamping tool is big enough that I can do that with just rotating my card here. So I have that Versamark stamped on there. I'm going to put the clear powder on there and melt it. So this is going to give that seahorse a different texture from my background and really make it pop out a little bit more. Once I have it melted with my embossing tool, I can then go put it right back in the Misti stamping tool and I can stamp my sentiment with it. And this color layer set comes with a few different sentiments, which are perfect, and they're oceany themed, so they're perfect for these cards. So I can take that solid image off of there, and I do clean it in between time because I'm going to make a second card. I want to make sure that there's no ink left on there before I put it away. If there's ink left on there, when I go to position it for the second one, as I'm moving the stamp around, it's going to leave little bits of ink. So it's going to not create a great image. So by cleaning it off before putting it away, I can make sure that I have it placed as perfectly as possible. Now, even though these pieces of cardstock are warped, it's going to be fine for when I put my card together. I'm going to be able to press it down with an acrylic block and some weight in order to get it to glue down flat. If it's something that you're worried about, what you could do before doing the embossing, before doing the stamping, is you could take some pieces of newsprint and just iron it to get it flat. I've heard of other people using a laminator machine to run it through to kind of iron it out. I don't have a laminator machine, so if I were to do that, I would use an iron with some newsprint, if that bothers you. For what I was doing, I knew I was going to be able to get it flat afterwards, so I didn't really worry about it too much. So for my second card, I am doing that seahorse more in the corner where I put that inking. And the three colors that I'm using for this one is Spun Sugar, Kitsch Flamingo, and Picked Raspberry. Now, same as the first one, I am doing the first layer solid with the lightest color, and I'm going to leave that stamp in the Misti stamping tool. And here's where you're going to see how it's very helpful to take a little piece of printer paper and put it underneath that stamp. Because this stamp is now towards the edge of my Misti stamping tool, it catches and grips on the grip mat. And it's going to make my placement for this second layer off. But I didn't redo it. And the main reason I didn't redo it is A, I wanted to remember to mention it. And B, because I had to wait overnight for those bubbles to dry and for that cardstock to completely dry, I didn't want to start all over again and redo those bubbles. Now it works fine. My image is not quite as crisp as the first one, but I still like the way it ended up turning out. But I wanted to make sure that I had this reminder in order to tell you that a little piece of printer paper here underneath that stamped image would avoid this. So I've got my second one lined up here, and what I didn't realize was that that stamp had caught onto that grip mat, lifted it up, moved it up slightly so that my image placement wasn't perfect. And you can see me playing with that there. So the image is a little bit fuzzy, but once again, I like how it looked. So once I have my second and third layer done, I'm putting it back to that first solid image, and I'm going to do the same thing as my first card. I have my stamp here. It's completely cleaned, and I took my Versamark pad and I'm stamping it a couple times just to make sure that I have some good coverage with that Versamark ink, and I'm going to emboss it with that clear powder. Now, this particular color layering stamp set comes with a few shells and a starfish, and I want to create a cluster in the corner here. And by covering this particular one with embossing powder, not only am I creating a different texture from the background, but I'm also creating a resist. So when I go in and stamp my shells and my starfish, I'm not going to get that covering my seahorse. And you can see here how that second one, that pink one, is not as pristine and not as crisp as the second one, or as the first one. Before I go and stamp my shells and starfish, I'm taking the sentiment stamp, and there's two different ones in this set. I'm using the two different ones for the different cards. I couldn't decide between the two, and this was the solution, is to use one with one card and one with another card. So with my sentiment stamped, I can start stamping my shells as well as the starfish. So the first shell I'm going to do in shaded lilac and wilted violet, same as my first seahorse. The second shell is going to be old paper and brushed corduroy. And then when I do my starfish, I wanted him to be orange, so I used some dried marigold and ripe persimmon. And the layering is exactly the same as the seahorse. The only difference is the shells and the starfish only have 2 layers and the seahorse has 3. And just like before, if you're not 100% sure about your placement, you could put a little piece of acetate or recycled packaging or something clear to stamp on top of, so that you can check that. But they are fairly easy to be able to see. It's one of those things that I think requires just a little bit of practice, and then you become a little bit more comfortable with layering your stamps. These ones being completely clear make it a little bit easier as well. And also the fact that the seahorse is covered in clear embossing powder, I'm not worried about double stamping or something, or covering that or muddling that stamped image. It's going to resist it. I will take a towel and I will wipe any ink that sticks to the front of it. But this is a cute way to add just a little bit of texture, a little bit of a cluster. And I love the fact that these are all included in that same stamp set. Now I'm using distress inks for all of these stamped images. You could use other inks as well, other brands of dye-based ink, or even like an oxide would work. The only thing that I would suggest, same as before, is to make sure to clean your stamps in between using and putting back in the package, so that you know that they're clean next time you go and pick them up. But these color layering stamps work well with many different inks. And I love the fact that they are clear, so it's really easy to see exactly where they're going to be stamping and what they're going to be covering. And it also makes the positioning for the color layering super easy as well. Hero Arts also does a really great job on the back of the packaging, and I think I showed it at the beginning of the video. It shows you exactly which layers go together and how to layer them together. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork out of trying to figure out for yourself, as well as the fact that it also gives you a color suggestion. Often I will go and Google whatever animal it is just to see some color suggestions and pick inks to go with that. But it's always nice to have a sample to start from and then go from there. Now I thought this cluster would look nice with some seaweed, so I'm taking some Shabby Shutters re-inker and just using my water brush and creating some very simple seaweed strands or whatnot. I just thought it would kind of anchor everything together so it's not sitting there floating. Makes it look a little bit more like it's on the ocean floor and that we've got these shells and the starfish there. Once that is done, I will let that dry for just a few minutes. It's not going to take very long, and it would work well with basically any green that you wanted to do. I have my layers here that I'm going to glue together for the base of my card. I'm just using some Barely Art glue to glue it together and have it in a fine tip bottle so I can get it all over the place. Now, This is where I take that layer, because it's so very warped, use my acrylic block on top of it. And I also have a jar full of glass beads that sit on my desk, and it works really well for a weight. So I will put that on it as well, just to hold everything down, just give it a little bit of extra weight and make sure that everything dries nice and flat. And I will leave it there for longer than I normally would. If I have flat layers, I don't usually lay it or leave it there for very long. It's just a couple minutes. Here, I'll leave it till it's completely dried. And I'll repeat this with the second one. Once everything is together, I'll put my acrylic block on top. While this glue is wet, you want to make sure that those layers are nice and straight. If anything is out of whack, you want to make sure to fix it now, because once it's completely dried, that's too late. So here are the finished cards, but I want to add one more detail. I have some black enamel accents here, and I'm going to add it to the eye. I love using this black enamel accents for eyes on things. It gives a little bit of dimension as well as texture. Let that dry completely. And because I'm not using a whole lot, it doesn't really need to take too long for that to dry, but I do want to make sure to dry it completely. The next step I'm doing is using some glossy accents and just adding some air bubbles. Now, glossy accents is super easy to use for this. The drying time is going to depend on how much you're using. I have a nice fine tip put on my bottle so that I can get as precise as I want, but it's another way to add just a little bit of extra texture to this. I'm going to leave that to completely dry, and you'll see how it goes from kind of a milky look to completely clear. Before you put your glossy accents away, you want to make sure to tap it on your desk and make sure that that nozzle is completely clear from any of the glossy accents so it doesn't clog. Here we are after everything is completely dried, and I love the different textures you get between the embossing and the flat stamping as well as the bubbles, and those glossy accent bubbles look absolutely adorable and just give it a really cool texture to the card. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you had fun learning a little bit of a different background and how to create bubbles on your background. Have a great day.